Before we move on with this panel, I thought I'd quickly introduce myself. We have here a panel of very experienced people who are driving policy thinking on the African continent. I'm delighted to have David and also have myself on this panel because I think we represent the youth voice on Africa. So we'll balance out the conversation to make sure that we're challenging our policymakers in the room and also on the panel with questions regarding how the work that they're doing is affecting. Yes. I will also welcome the CEO of NEPAD, who should be joining our panel. Thank you, sir. So to kick off the conversation, my first question goes to you, Mrs. Ole. The African Development Bank launched its Jobs for Youth in Africa strategy in 2016. Your studies show that every year we have about 10 to 12 million young people joining the marketplace in Africa. What's your thinking behind enabling the African continent to create more jobs? And what's the unique contribution that the African Development Bank is playing?
Thank you very much. I think one of the concerns that the African Development Bank had was, and first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. It's also a pleasure to be in Rwanda. It's the place to be when we talk about innovation and when we talk about job creation and youth empowerment. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you. Yes. But going back to your question, I think it dawned on us that we are able to create about 3 million jobs, yet we have about 11 million youth that are entering the job market. So there is a huge gap between what is being provided for the youth and what is available. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that the jobs that we have been, or the preparedness we've had for the youth has not necessarily translated into the current job market. So the African Development Bank decided to come up with a very bold and ambitious vision of trying to create 25 million jobs over the next 10 years and in trying to impact about 50 million people. And in trying to create the 25 million jobs, the bank realized that it needed to look at jobs for the future, jobs that would resonate with their emerging markets, the emerging issues, jobs that would provide opportunities for youth to be employed and be self-employed and to also create employment. And so this ambitious vision of trying to create 25 million jobs, we decided to look at 3 pillars that would focus on agriculture, on industrialization, and on information, communication, and technology. And under that, particularly on the technology, we're trying to really look at how we create employment in the digital economy. Coding for employment. We're just about to launch our Coding for Employment program that we've created, and we want to also create 130 centers of excellence across the continent. So there's a lot that the bank is trying to do. Under the agriculture, we're also trying to encourage more youth to go into the agricultural sector. There's always been the stigma of anyone who goes into the agriculture sector is a farmer. As parents, we didn't want our kids to go into the sector. We wanted our kids to be lawyers. We wanted them to be, doctors and so on. But we've come to realize that agriculture actually is a viable economic business that we should encourage our youth to go into. So under the agriculture pillar, we have now created an Enable Youth, where we were trying to get more youth to go into agriculture. to look at agriculture not for subsistence, but to look at agriculture as a business, making agriculture sexy, and trying to help them to provide startups and to create opportunities for them to participate in the entire agriculture value chain. Now, so that's the key area that the bank is trying to work on. And we are engaging with several partners, so we're not trying to do it all. We've invested over $2 billion US on the entire process of trying to create jobs through education, through skills development, in science, technology, and innovation in STEM, and with the ultimate goal of creating employment. So this is a very ambitious vision, and we aim to try and achieve that, but looking at different areas and engaging with different partners. Within the bank as well, we are also trying to look at creating counting jobs to ensure that all the work that we do in the bank and the programs and initiatives that we support ensures that there is a percentage of youth involved in that creation of the entire job market with the countries that we are working with. There's a huge emphasis particularly in the science, in the hard sciences, particularly on science, technology, and innovation, where we target 50% or more, 60% or more young girls, young women to go into those areas, because we feel that there are not enough women and girls going into that market. So I'll stop for now, but I'll elaborate more on what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that first introduction, and we'll come back to you with questions around human capital development in Africa, where the gaps are and what's being done currently. Now, over to you, Dr. Obiagala. We're really delighted to have...
Call me Obi.
Obi, Dr. Obi.
It'll be a lot easier for you. Just call me Obi. Yes.
So we're really honored to have you here. You are an incredible voice on the African continent. I'm going to refer to something important that you did. In 2014, when the abduction of 300 girls took place in Nigeria, you took the lead to raise awareness and call for action so that government and whatever resources would be rallied towards ensuring the security of these girls. Now, when we speak about resilient economies, an important element of that is security. We've seen how African nations have been affected by insecurity over the past few years, and one of the threats that still exist is security. What do you see as being the role of government and other stakeholders in ensuring that security is maintained going forward for more resilient economies?
Thank you so very much, and quite a delight to be on this panel with a very good cast of people speaking from different perspectives on this topic of resilience and the competitive African economy. To your question on the role of government in building resilient systems of security, I think that one of the first things to establish is that the immediate thought of a militaristic approach to security makes us lose sight of the fact that everything about building stable societies come from even thinking of security more elaborately to be human security. If we looked at it from that perspective of human security, then we would understand that achieving inclusive economic growth and reducing inequality, stopping any brittleness of society, and any sense that there are certain people who are supposed to be marginal to what others do in societies, create the basis for stronger community and society. This human security perspective therefore suggests that the human being is at the center of everything you'd say about security. You talked about our Chibok girls. When those girls were abducted, their abduction was one of a series of things that kept escalating without society paying the right attention to the events. What got me to the place of taking a stance and saying, no, okay, thus far has it gone on. We can't afford to be a society where nearly 250 girls, there were 219 of them, were taken away, and our society was just going to carry on like nothing happened. What it said to me was basically that we had become a society that had internalized the idea that our human beings don't matter. You can't be a society where your human beings don't matter. The reason that human beings often don't matter in a number of the countries on our continent is because the governance process can carry on without a sense that there are human beings to cater for. The governance process has been enabled by a very strong concentration of revenue that comes from natural resources. And so the human being, their productivity, their competitiveness have not really mattered to governments as constituted across the continent. People can carry on governing, getting money into the public coffers, poorly managing them, while society loses one citizen after another, and it wouldn't make a difference. So many things came together for me in terms of standing for Chibok girls and for all others that were abducted, saying it is time for us to place the human being back at the center of what governance is. Because, by the way, if we made the human being the center of governance, then what would happen is we would spend our time thinking of how to make the human being productive. It's the productivity challenge that Africa is dealing with. We're trapped in low productivity. And I think that certain gentleman who is my brother at the other end would be able to talk a little bit more of these things because he concentrated effort at UNECA on these matters. This productivity issue is an innovation issue because what are the synonyms that I love for innovation? I love upheaval and I love revolution as synonyms of innovation. So that if government needs to be taken back to where it should be on security matters, we would say to government, in today's world, it's going to be easy to find the technological solutions to ordinary security. So you want to have intelligence assets. If you have the money, you can purchase. You want to have a more equipped military, it's pretty easy to order equipment. There are many countries that are ready to compete to sell to you. But if you did all of this, but you don't have good economic policies that will ensure that everyone has a stake in the growth in your society, you're wasting your time. It's going to be an unstable society. It's not going to be a resilient society. We're going to say that if you do not have a policy of inclusion that basically says equal opportunity cannot guarantee you equal outcomes. However, we assure you that we understand how to manage our diversity, and therefore our policy would enable you, no matter who you are, to have equality of access to what she was saying about education. Education is the best tool we know for ensuring social and economic mobility of any group of people. So that enters into the equation to build the role of government in security today's world. And finally, to understand that no longer can you shut your borders. So we know that terrorism is a global public bad. So everybody has a responsibility for every other person. And so the regional integration approach, where we're looking at institutions building differently from the way we used to think of them. So policy, regulation, institutions, and investments can be regionalized in the kind of way that they give us much more sense that we are protecting every African, not just every Rwandan, every Nigerian, but every African.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I appreciated the link between security and inclusive development and inclusive policies, especially because young people are prone to being mobilized by these groups.
Yes.
It's very important that policies are inclusive. Now, speaking of policies, I'd like to reach out to you, Professor Carlos. We're delighted to have you today. You were on the task force working on AU reform, and one of the most recent achievements for Africa is the continental signing of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. It's bringing us closer to the aspirations of the fathers of the Pan-African movement. Now, what is the AU doing to move forward, to move from agreement signing into making this free trade area a reality for Africans, common man, and for the young people who are in this room?
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity. I think the Continental Free Trade Area is by far the most significant instrument created by OAU-AU since 1963. So we can see it from different angles, but the dream of regional integration is only going to happen if it happens with the technical competence and the tools that allow for the states to engage in a way that is formal and in a way that is practical and pragmatic and not just ideological. So what we had for a long time was a Pan-African ideological mantra that everybody espoused in the continent, but we didn't have the instruments that transformed that into something practical. The Continental Free Trade Area is seeing light at the time of protectionism and doubts about whether really free trade is the way to go. And one can understand that for countries that are latecomers to industrialization, like most of the African countries, we may consider that free trade is not necessarily a blueprint for us to be able to accelerate industrialization, because the conditions that prevailed when others did it are no longer available to Africa. I espouse the opposite view. I believe that one of the advantages that we have in having a free trade area is to be able to protect Africa to some extent, not completely, but some large extent, to establish its own value chains in areas where it is still possible to do so. And not all are available, but some are. For instance, on agro-processing, there is a huge opportunity that is there for African countries to take advantage of the Continental Free Trade Area to accelerate industrialization. And we have to understand that this common tariff is not a panacea. It's just a way of creating the conditions for integrating markets. And by integrating markets, it's not just about trade. It has to be about much more. We see that trade can be an entry point, but then you will have to have harmonization, convergence of policies in a number of areas. From the trade perspective, you will move on the ladder to more complex undertakings. And that's what happened with any free trade area. We see doubts being expressed about whether we have the determination to actually implement this. I believe that if you look into all that has happened in 2018 so far, and we are just in June, it's quite remarkable. So we are discussing the blue economy in a much more dense way. We have the open skies policy that has already been adopted by 23 countries. You have the African passport, which is basically a treaty for free circulation of people that is expanding fast. You have the continental free trade area. You have also the EU reform and its financing mechanisms taking shape, with close to 30 countries already either implementing or committed. So we have a wave of transformations that are all related to this EU reform. One can say that finally there is a motivation politically to translate what has been a lot of dreams into practical instruments and tools. And this is happening so fast that the skeptics are actually being a bit surprised. For instance, they say it took a long time to negotiate the continental free trade area, and yet you have a number of protocols that are not yet completely finalized. Well, just compare with any free trade area, and you will see that this particular negotiation within Africa has been faster than the experiments equivalent in other regions of the world. Some will say, well, but countries are signing the economic partnership agreements with Europe in a fragmented way, and that can undermine the continental free trade area. And I think the response to that is to say that, yes, they have signed because they were under pressure, but they didn't ratify. So there is not a single EPA that has been ratified, because countries are dragging their feet. And while dragging their feet on EPAs, they have established a continental free trade area that is going to overwhelm whatever agreements have been reached in a fragmented way through the EPAs, and will create the opportunity to be seized, of course, but create the opportunity for one single agreement. So I think there are dynamics at play right now that are favorable to Africa like never before. And it's symptomatic because we are in a world where economic governance has become very complex. Obi was just mentioning the productivity dimension. It's like a ladder. We are at the bottom of the ladder. If we evolve any steps in that ladder, it's incredible productivity gains and creation of employment. But we are not yet, and will not be for a long time, at the top of that ladder of productivity, which is based on intensive technology and intellectual property. So we are in that level of complexity of the world. The economic governance would have required, globally, a much more sophisticated approach to the different challenges that we are facing, including the challenge of technology. And yet, we are witnessing a world where the political systems are, basically moving in the opposite direction of complexity. They are becoming rudimentary, they are becoming incapable, they are becoming fragile, they are becoming inadequate. So we have this paradox to deal with. And as latecomers to all of this, when it comes to the economic side, Africa has an opportunity to leapfrog and basically to jump the queue and adopt some of the best possible solutions in many fronts. But for that, it requires a unified Africa, and it requires a sophisticated leadership.
Yeah. I'd like to think and say that young people and the common man in Africa really wants to see this happen, because it makes more sense for us to trade. The borders are pretty much virtual, and people want to go beyond these borders. Before I move on to the next person, I wanted to hear your perspective, because our next conversation will be about something else. What do you have to say to those who are still skeptical about this continental free trade area? What does Africa stand to benefit or lose if we're able to achieve it, or if we're unable to achieve it? What's the value in economic terms? And speaking to the issues of job creation and transforming the structure of our economies, where does Africa stand?
Well, I normally say that skepticism, cynicism, doubts anxiety are manifestations of people not being happy. And we have to turn that energy into dynamism. So it's not bad to be skeptical or to be doubtful. It basically puts pressure on the leadership. Basically says, should we believe you? You have promised this so many times. Are you going to do it? And it is a pressure point. And we need to transform it into a dynamic process that responds to that skepticism. I know of a lot of leaders, not all, but I know of a lot of African leaders that are really very knowledgeable about what needs to be done, but for inertia, status quo reasons, don't move. It's getting them out of the comfort zone. So it's not a question of knowing what is right, it's about doing what is right. And to move them from knowing to doing, skepticism, doubtful, pressure is necessary. So for the common layperson in the street, as you put it, I will encourage them to be as harsh, as difficult, as tough as they can with the leadership, because that's a precondition for real change.
Can I just say something on this free trade thing? I think that what's important is for the regular citizen on the continent to understand the sheer economies of scale that come with the free trade area. The fact that very tiny economies will end up fixing the extent of your possibilities. But for you to be a part of free trade, if you cannot trade with the rest of the world, you can at least trade with Africa. Can Africa trade with Africa? I think the answer is yes. We're seeing more of that, especially amongst those of you that are of this younger generation. I see many times Kenyans streaming into Nigeria, Nigerians streaming into Kenya. You're finding yourselves, regardless of government. Imagine what would then happen when government is able to understand that there are opportunities there. There is, business to business is carrying on with a context of very tough barriers that are put in the way. The whole idea of this free trade takes away the barriers. And when the barriers are gone, these businesses are more competitive. The people who run them are more productive. There is an incentive there for every one of you to be an advocate of free trade. And please let nobody sort of say to me that, Trump and the others are going in the way of protectionism. So let our countries protect infant businesses. I tell you, that's a wrong economics. That's not going to be helpful to a number of the economies in Africa. We're better off getting our economic integration to be deeper, to be stronger, because it would make us readier to face the rest of the world.
Thank you for that intervention, and we're on the same page on that. I will come back to you later on the policies that need to be reformed to achieve that.
Sure.
Now, Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, we're really delighted to have you here. As a representative of NEPAD, an AU institution, an AU agency, you have established investment programs that are addressing the new and emerging trends in Africa. Could you talk to us a bit more about that and how you are streamlining innovation, engaging young people in your processes?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And I fully adhere to the factors on which Carlos did put the emphasis. So let me give figures to just have an idea of why innovation is important. Let's take the case of a country like Mali, 20 million inhabitants, and demographic growth rate of 3.8 to 4.2, because Africa still has not gone through its demographic transition. 75% of its population in rural areas. And with this demographic growth rate of 3.8, it means very concretely that on the employment market every year, you have cohorts of young which are estimated at about 250,000 to 300,000. Cohorts of young for whom Mali needs to create jobs. So you can also take the example of Tanzania, which has roughly the double of the population of Mali, and Benin, which has half the population of Mali, and get the calculations done. So how does Mali create 300,000 jobs per year? They can't hire them in their civil service, evidently. Mali has an incipient industry, so the capacity of the incipient Malian industry to absorb is extremely limited. So what does Mali do? 75% of this population lives in rural areas. Mali cannot do without agricultural transformation. But in order to not accumulate these levels of non-employment that will destabilize Mali's governance systems, Mali needs to fast track. So the key issue in terms of policy design and policy implementation is acceleration in the case of Mali. And you can't accelerate if you don't innovate. And that applies to most of our countries. So the main trigger of change in all our systems, political, economical, social systems, will have to do with how do we innovate and how do we innovate adequately in order to accelerate. Our economic growth rates are about, between 3 and 4. We know that we need to get at 7 in order to really transform. And that's why the instruments that are being put in place through the reform of the African Union are extremely critical and essential. So innovation, coming back to it, will be critical. Let's go back to Mali. In order to increase agricultural productivity, you will need a better access to energy. We have here, during this summit, a high-level panel on emerging technologies, which was created by the African Union and composed of very highly eminent African scientists, and they targeted very specific emerging technologies that can allow acceleration. Let's take the case of access to energy. They focused on microgrids, and this is readily implementable. They focused on drones for agricultural productivity. So the leapfrogging dimension to which Carlos was referring to can be very concretely addressed. They focused on gene drives for malaria control. And all the social impact and economic impact that malaria has. And this gene drive approach can be used in other domains. So innovation for acceleration. The second point is Africa has a median age population which has a median age of 19. Europe has a median age of 47. Africa cannot be governed as Europe is governed. Our governance systems need to be adapted to that median age of 19. So how are we going to do it? I don't know. But the question remains essential. If we do not reform our political systems so that they focus on the needs of the youth, we can enter very destabilizing processes. And so institutional innovation will be critical. And the third point is about the policy options. Some will tell you education is a priority. Some will tell you industrial policy is a priority. Some will tell you energy is a priority, because if you don't solve the energy problem, then you can't industrialize. Some will tell you, well, health is a priority, because if you don't have a sound human capital, then you can't develop. The problem is, the challenges we face are not mono-sectoral, they are multi-sectoral. And in terms of policy options, it's absolutely critical that we adapt our public administration systems to that multi-sectorality. And the main criteria of a performance of a government will not be linked to how well that government does in education, energy, transport, health. It will be linked to the fact that all these sectors are moving together at the same time. And in order to do that, you will also need innovation, because nobody has done that exactly in the same way and in the same context before. So that's why innovation is really fundamental.
Thank you so much for that. I heard a couple of themes coming up. So modernization of agriculture, leapfrogging our infrastructure challenges in energy, and making sure that institutions are taking youth into consideration and moving everything forward at the same time. So innovation certainly has a place, and I think we'll have an opportunity later in the session to engage the innovators and contribute in some of the ways that they're thinking about that. We're fortunate to have with us one of the innovators, David. Thank you for allowing me to give you the last take on this, since you've now accumulated what everyone has been talking about. Yours is focused on enabling cross-border traders, small businesses, to get more information about the market, about market pricing, fluctuations in currency, and do that so that they are able to trade more profitably. Can you tell us why it is important that these traders have access to this information, and what are you learning as a business that is relevant to this conversation around how we can transform the structure of African economies? You said you're currently in Kenya and Uganda. What are you learning?
Oh, thank you so much. First and foremost, it's a great honor to be in the middle of these great people from Africa. So when you're looking at trade across the borders, especially for the small and medium enterprises, on many occasions there are many interventions that only are geared towards helping those who are big boys in business. But then for those people who are really small in trade, like those kind of women, for example, who carry their goods on their back and on their head, and they have to go across the custom yards in order for them to buy goods, they always face a lot of challenges, because first and foremost, they do not enjoy the luxury of technology, like most of us can't be in a position to enjoy right now. Another thing is, like, not all of them are as educated as we are, but then those notwithstanding, they're also supposed to get this information, because whenever you cross the border, that territory is different from your home territory. There are rules that you must follow. But now with this information asymmetry, what then happens with them? How can they be helped? I mean, I come from a small town in the western part of Kenya. And I used to say this a lot. I mean, I could see my mother crossing over to Uganda to go buy goods, but then she doesn't come back with the goods. Reason being, she ended up at some point like buying goods that the taxes were really high, so she couldn't afford to pay the taxes when she got the customs. And you see, it's only fair that the customs guys would confiscate the goods. And you see, that was really trouble for us because we depended on our mother for our daily livelihoods. And then on some occasions again, like she will come back, I mean, like really, really frustrated. I mean, like, and her frustrations would basically get back to us as the family. So I looked at this and then said, well, we have a situation where they have access to these simple feature phones. What then can we use these feature phones to use, for example, to enable them be in a position also to trade at the same level as those people, for example, who have computers, those people who can hire consultants to tell them more about trade and stuff like that. And then I said, there is a way. So other than that, there have been some interventions that government agencies have been putting in place, especially on the Kenyan side and on the Ugandan side. But these interventions are not sustainable. For example, like, a group of people brought in some meeting and then like they're sensitized on what they need to do. I mean, sensitization is good, but then at the end of the day, what is this person going back home with? I mean, at the end of the day, you'll realize that maybe this person at the end of that sensitization meeting forgets everything, and then the following day makes the same mistakes. So we said that it is important that we think of a check kind of a solution to this using the technology and the gadgets that they already have. And that is why we said, okay, fine, an application will really be ideal, but then they don't own smartphones. What they have are just but simple feature phones. And then we also looked at it and said, okay, fine, for this government information, I mean, the language that is used is super technical for this kind of women. They cannot understand. I mean, if you're telling a woman who never went to school of simplified trade regime, you're telling this lady of phytosanitary certificate, for example, chances are high she will never know. So what she will do next is, because she also doesn't want to show everyone that she does know, what she'll do is like now she'll use the ungazetted routes. And in those ungazetted routes, challenges are even compounded. We have evidence of some women who are even sexually assaulted because they used the panya routes. We know of women who try to cross the borders using rivers and they drowned. So these were issues that were really difficult. So what we did then was come up with this platform, and then we were able to talk to them, engage them, understand what are their frustrations, and how best we can be in a position to help this addressed. So first and foremost, these women will probably tell us that, you see, one, they don't even understand the taxes they need to pay for their imports. I mean, like, of course we have our governments and it's all our responsibilities to pay taxes. But then how do you do it if you don't even know what you need to pay? So you find someone probably going to Uganda, buying some goods, gets the customs, those goods are super taxed, then what happens next? Nothing goes on. In some situations, these women are like, they're forced to buy the goods and sell at suboptimal prices, because when they're moving out there to go buy the goods, they got no idea how those goods are selling. So you find that on many occasions, they will buy goods maybe at some price, and then the prices are not really competitive for them, and then they also have to sell them at very uncompetitive prices because they do not know. On some occasions, again, issues to do with documentation. I think for all of you, it could really be easy for you. Like if you want to cross the border, you have an idea that maybe you need a passport. These women do not even know what a passport is. I mean, you tell them about a yellow fever card, they got no idea what this card is. But you see, those are requirements for sure. So based on these challenges, what we were able to do is like, we looked at one, the fact that they're not really educated, and decided to simplify this information to a level that can be easily understood. And look at it this way, even in government offices, if you're going to get this information, the information is agency specific. For example, you want information on standards, you have to go to the Bureau of Standards. You want information on issues to do with taxes, you have to go to the revenue authorities. But you see, this woman or this lady is not in a position to go to all these offices to get this information at the same time. So that is why now we say we're bringing all this information together so that they're in a position to get it just on the hit of their simple feature phone.
So you're addressing educating the women on the policies or the regulations around trade. You bring up issues issues on harmonization, the need for harmonization of policies across the borders, because it doesn't make sense for the common man to have to struggle with these issues when they're trying to survive. And I had promised to come back to you, Dr. Obi, to talk about the need for policy reforms to enable African economies to structurally shift from where they are. That's the reference to David's story is really about trade, cross-border trade. But we've also talked about the need for modernization of agriculture. How do innovators come in and play the role that they should be playing? Please advise us.
One thing that we as Africans must make peace with is that policies work. Frankly, for a long time, Africans struggled with policies, especially economic policies. We struggled unnecessarily. We lost so much time. You were reading some of the growth data for the continent. There were 2 decades that were considered lost decades for our continent. The 80s and the 90s were awful decades in terms of growth for the continent. Our population growth rate was above 3%. Our growth rate, economic growth rate, was sometimes minus 1%. So we were in trouble. The 2000s began to show up with a real understanding that economic policies have a certain level of universalism in application, especially just managing your monetary policy, managing your fiscal policy. As more of our countries began to understand this and began to make the right sets of economic policy choices, we moved away from very terrible macroeconomic instability that was all over the continent, and we began to dig ourselves out of the hole. We began to run tidier public finance. And, we attained relative macroeconomic stability with more stable exchange rates, with inflation that's no longer double digit all over the place, sometimes, runaway inflation. We began to have better environment for businesses to thrive. Economic policies became better, and what do you think happened? Growth resumed. Now, the growth that resumed took us to between 4 and 5% on the average over a period of a decade or so, until the global financial and economic crisis happened, and we got a shortfall, and then growth resumed again. But even then, as the commodity super cycle came to an end, we tumbled again. What phase are we in? We're in that phase where the structural reforms that should complement our ability to manage basic monetary and fiscal policies should now drive growth to higher levels of 7 and above % annually. We need the kind of sophistication to understand what each sector that could be a source of economic growth for us as a people can generate. So whether it's agriculture, whether it's manufacturing we're still at less than 15% of manufacturing as GDP. In most of the countries that have gone ahead of us, whether it's the Asian tigers, they had to get to as much as 35 to 40%, because that's where the whole productivity comes in and you get the benefit of it. Now, I hear a lot of us talking about agriculture, but a lot of people talk of agriculture from the perspective of expanding production, not improving productivity. We need to think of policies in agriculture in terms of improving productivity. What's the yield for those kinds of agric staples or whatsoever for us compared to India or to Vietnam or to Thailand? What's our yield? We need to be able to improve the yield, because when we improve our yields, our productivity on one piece of land is better than expanding into more pieces of land. Agribusiness matches with technology today. Some of the young ones are excited suddenly about agriculture because of some of the things, even some of what he said. Just moving away from information asymmetry through the power of technology enhances integration to markets. Those kinds of things matter in policy making. You look at what he was trying to say about the small businesses. A lot of countries spend so much time trying to improve on the World Bank doing business ranking, because they have in mind that if we can just do better, big businesses will come into our countries. When really, the most important thing is how to do better for small businesses. We tried such a thing when I was vice president at the World Bank for Africa region. We tried such a thing with a country like Madagascar to see how removing the barriers for small businesses could enhance economic growth. It worked. It shouldn't be surprising, because, countries like South Korea and Singapore, 75% of the jobs that you talk about, where they almost attain full employment, is because of small businesses. So we as a continent, we must think of policies in a way that enables us get sound policies into those sectors where we can play to our comparative advantage, because that is huge. The key point for me as far as policies go now is that we really need almost like crazy people in government. The reason is that we've got to just overturn a lot of the traditional ways of doing things. We need people with big ideas who are not afraid of trying some crazy things, because today's world is a world for those who would dare to try crazy things. I look at the opportunities that today's disruptive technologies would offer us to completely overhaul many sectors. Why are we not embracing that boldness? When I look at the young ones gathered around this, when I came in the morning and I saw the sheer size of the young ones hungry to make something of the continent, it says something to us. The energy, the zeal, the talent is there. And what we need to think of is it possible that we have many Elon Musks on the continent and we don't yet know? Elon Musk is saying to us he's going to do a hyperloop that would make you go from New York to Washington, D.C. in 29 minutes. In 29 minutes. Come on. Elon Musk entered into what was that thing? It was like a bet with some billionaire, because a province in Australia was running into power cuts, just like any typical African country. And the gentleman said, if you can fix this in 100 days, this is what's on the table for you. He took it on, and he did it. So all of these problems that we sort of think we cannot fix, we can fix them. So what's the missing link between policy in every sector that we need to overhaul and change and, get into that place of results from policy? It's actually the quality of leadership. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore said, no country can grow beyond the quality of the leaders. And leadership for policy is also what will give us leadership for institutions building. It's also what will give us leadership for the right priorities of investments. As he said, an integrated solution is a solution that enables you to see that as you're enhancing productivity and providing critical infrastructure, you need to make the environment friendly for business. You need to support the integration process so that growth can happen from many sources at the same time.
So you've spoken about macroeconomic stability, if I may, fiscal stability as well, policies that enable that, harmonization, monetary stability have been important. And you've spoken about the need to give small businesses the opportunity to thrive.
To have the right policies that address their specific needs.
Yeah.
Our political leaders have an incentive to look to the foreign investor. They think if this big company can come, then I'm going to be fine. A lot of economic growth is stranded in these young ones that we saw here today. They're going to be the ones who, if the policy environment is right and enables them, they will be employers of 7. I was in a session earlier where the gentleman was saying he finished school in Texas, went back to Nigeria, he now employs 7 people doing something that's technology-based in education. We want many of that.
Yeah.
It's in the realm of policy, it's in the realm of political big thinkers that we can get to those kinds of solutions. And you know what? It's so fiercely urgent. Our demographics, we will be in trouble as a continent if we go on this steady pace that we're following. This low equilibrium is not sustainable. So we must disrupt this sense of complacency where people are very glad to be praised for growing at 6%. We need double-digit growth.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Obi. I think that brings us some clarity on the areas of policy that governments should focus on to ensure that economies can continue to shift. Now, before we go back to the issue of enabling agriculture to continue to grow, which is a pertinent question, I think, because our agriculture sector is definitely challenged in terms of productivity. And it continues to be the largest employer. And Africa's agriculture sector has a lot of potential. Now, I'm going to throw that question back at you. Please be prepared. But also throw the question to the audience and invite those who have been doing some work in the industry to share what they're doing. Before we get there, human capital development is essential. If we are going to shift the way the makeup of our economies in the next 20, 30 years, we need to invest into human capital today. And I'm going to address this question to you, Mrs. Olay. What do you, when you paint the picture of a different continent, a different workforce in 2050, what does that look like? And what are the investments that need to be done today to ensure that 30 years from now, Africa will have different types of jobs, will have a more modern agriculture? Because I think that's where innovation is going to come from the people. And it's going to, economic development is going to come from the people. So what does that look like? And what are the investments that are required to be made today to ensure that we achieve that?
I think building on all the discussions that's been going on, I think there is a huge need to build on human capital as an investment. We realize that, for example, in the education sector, going to school has not necessarily translated into quality learning. We realize that the entire education architecture has not prepared our youth for the job market. We talk about industrializing the continent. We talk about the energy sector, we talk about the policies. If we do not invest in human capital, if we do not build the skills, we will not be able to achieve all these visions and dreams and aspirations that we want. I just came back from Busan, where the bank was hosting its annual meeting. And there's a lot of talk about how South Korea got to where it is. And the response from the president was heavy investment in human capital. That's what got them to shift from where they were 60 years ago. Heavy investment in science and technology. A couple of days ago, I was having a discussion with the Minister for Youth in Rwanda, and she outlined the amount of work that's been going on in terms of preparing the youth, getting them to take responsibility, engaging with them, not as beneficiaries, but as decision makers. Just as Dr. Obi had said, for me, I don't even think we are going to have a problem. We already have a problem. And I think the huge challenge that we have now is to really ensure that we take these youth. They're not the future, they are the present. We need to bring these youth on board. We need to give them, we need to provide the conducive environment. If it worked in South Korea, it can work in a small country. Rwanda 24 years ago, people were talking about something else in Rwanda. But like she said, leadership. It was discussed here. The issue of leadership, having a vision, knowing where you want to go, knowing how to use and capitalize the human capital is fundamental. And that's where we need to build the skills. We need to start building the leadership skills. We need to start ensuring that, the politicians that we have, a lot of our youth don't want to go into politics because they say it's corrupt. But if we don't build or encourage or nurture them into those areas, we will continue to maintain the corrupt politicians. So there is an emphasis on really ensuring that we build the human capital if we want this continent to expand. It's a non-negotiable. We cannot achieve what we want without going into digitalization. We have to build skills for the jobs for the future and the jobs for today. We're talking about the 4th industrial revolution. The 5th industrial revolution has crept in on us, and we don't even know. We're still talking about the 4th. There's a quantum leap here, and we're still talking about robotics. So when do we get to that stage if we do not prioritize on education, education, education? Now, I'm not saying education as in the classroom. Education can be outside of the classroom, but it's important to help his mother, it's important to help the youths, those going to school and those not going to school. Going to school, for the youths, not everyone is cut out for the classrooms. Youth, there are people who have skills. So why don't we capitalize on the skills development to be able to create the industries that we require for innovation, for agriculture, for energy, for integration? We need to develop that human capital skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. I have questions when we talk about human capital development and we say skills and we say Africa needs skills, we need skills today. Can we map out what type of skills those are that are needed? And perhaps before I come back to you with the same question, I want to open it up to the audience, because perhaps there are people in the audience who are interested in intervening either on the question of human capital development, agriculture modernization, or the other priority areas that Africa should be focusing on to actually transform the structure of our economies.
Can I just come in?
Yeah.
I think the question you're asking on what type of skills, I think we need education and skills for Africans, by Africans, that resonates within our own African context.
So market-driven skills.
Yeah, we need skills for the jobs that resonate with the African continent. That's what we need.
Thank you very much. So I think I have people in the room who have mics, and I see a gentleman, two gentlemen here who have questions. We'll take a couple of questions. I'll ask you all to be very concise with your questions. If it's a comment, they are welcome. Please be concise, else I may cut you off. Yes. Start with your name and where you come from and what you want to tackle. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gustav Manshimi. I'm from Kigali, Rwanda. Me, it's not a question, it's just a comment. For Madame Obi, as she said, I think as youth, the leader of tomorrow, if you help us with the good economic policies as a government, we think you can help us to remove market barriers. Our economy as Africans, it can grow so fast and easily as youth. I think it can be helpful for youth. For example, we used to make some stuff from Africa. For example, t-shirts, shirts, or something else. But it's really hard to sell it in America. But in America, we all wear Polo, something, Puma, Adidas. If you check ourselves right now, we can find some label from those countries. So I think you can help us to remove the barrier of marketing so that we can sell our stuff to other countries. Thank you, madam.
You just need to be competitive. Just be competitive, because if you want to protect, you will never grow. The thing I worry about concerning market protection is that it would limit your growth. Initially, it would seem as if you're benefiting, but it would limit your growth. I think start with us, with government, understanding that you must have an environment where your cost of doing business is not killing you. Once your cost of business is taken as low as possible, because critical infrastructure that you need is available, because you can find a pool of human talent that you need, because you can collaborate and cooperate with other players in the market that are complementary to what you do, your cost of doing business reduces, and it would make you more competitive, and the market would be better for you in that kind of a situation.
Thank you very much for that intervention. And for the following questions, may we take a few questions,
Okay.
3 to 4, before we intervene? Yes, the gentleman here.
Very provocative, but I just want to ask a simple question. Africa, the Europeans trade among us each other over 70%. The Asians over 50%. Africa used to be 7%. Now I'm told the figure's
12%.
or nearly 16%. We haven't reached yet 20%. We still trade with external, not each other, with the rest of the world, not with each other. We are not yet connected. Gaddafi saved enough gold to create the Afro so that we have our own World Bank, the African, our own IMF, but Nigeria and South Africa were, with Jonathan Badlack and others, they were not with him. Now, we have the Africa Trade Area, continental, South Africa, and Nigeria, the biggest economies, did not sign. I am not happy with us. The Lagos Plan of Action, 1980. We signed it in 1980. Where did we go? The Berg Report in 1981. 35 countries went one by one. Prisoner's dilemma. They ask you, come and sign, don't tell the next country. We Africans must be honest, sincere, with integrity, honesty, humility, at the same time with moral intelligence, emotional intelligence, psychological intelligence. We must learn to trust each other, to learn to support each other, value each other. Better I hurt myself than hurting you, my sister. That is our philosophy. Ubuntu, there's an I in you, there is a you in I. If we do that, the divide and rule, they took everything. They still take millions, billions out of Africa. Over 6 times more resources go out of Africa every year than what comes in. I am not happy as an African. Africa is in my heart and in my soul. And I am not happy with the way we treat each other. We had the best philosophy in the universe came from Africa. Almost everything original came from Africa. Even Julius Caesar said it. But why are we misbehaving? Let's you young people be change makers, game changers. I like you to join the Africa Union, Youth for Change, the African Talent Hub. I'm struggling, trust me. They fight me all the time, wherever I am. Until I die, better I become like Thomas Sankara and Lumumba. Better I be like that than anything else.
So,
thank you very much for
you.
your whatever.
I think that question, I would say, is related to perhaps the power, the political power that the African Union has to drive integration in this era. So we'll come back to our speakers to respond to that. Thank you. Can someone pass him the mic?
Oh, I think now it's working, yeah. Good afternoon, my name is Matthias, I'm from Germany, but currently based in Kampala. I'm also going to hop on this action and change, especially skepticism turning towards dynamism and the point of education, education, education. Just as a brief background, I'm co-founder of Startup Africa. We engage with universities here in East Africa with really hands-on and practical innovation and entrepreneurship program. So I'm really keen to know more about the role of higher education and how you see it in the whole transformation and the role of it in the equation, and what is also necessary on top of what's going on in higher education and at universities to be part of action towards innovation, towards the resilience and the competitiveness that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'll take two more and close the round of questions. Yes.
Yes, my name is Dalma Semenya. I'm from Kenya. I really want to agree, and the comments that have been made by the professor and the panelists resonate very powerfully with me in terms of the requirement for us to reconfigure our approach to human capital development. And I really think that the focus should be on the shift on human mentality. Because I think the difference, somebody said, between a rich person and a poor person is in their mentality, the mindset that they actually have. And I really think that's a point of shift that we must have, even in terms of talking about human capital development. The other thing, of course, is values. I strongly believe that the external things that people do is the 10% of the 90% that is inside of themselves. And I believe human capital development, as far as we should be concerned, should really focus on human values that we are developing and ingraining in the people that we are actually developing. Without values, we will still end up coping and doing the very wrong things. But having said that, I think we have, in the discussion we've had, tended to really drift towards technology and education. And I believe there is a very fundamental area that we haven't really addressed, which is social integration. I have for many years been involved with what we call the cooperative movement, which basically brings people together to create trust and relationships among themselves and cause them to bring together finances and use the same finances to financially include those who are otherwise unbanked and underbanked. And I have seen that as a very powerful tool that has integrated people and transformed their lives and empowered them economically, and particularly the young people that we're talking about today. And I actually look forward to probably in the next summit that we'll be having, some in-depth discussions on social integration, and particularly the issues of the cooperative movement in Africa, because Africa is leading in the cooperative movement, and particularly transformation that arises out of the power of people coming together and doing something. And I believe this is something that has been very strong within the African continent. And if you're talking about things that are applicable to our context, I believe there should be some in-depth discussion in as far as how that would be impactful. And I think even as we talk about issues of policy, I would also expect that we can also cascade discussions on policy to include financial sector deepening, because without that, we would then be missing a very important link in our development. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. We've had a lot of questions from the front, and I'm hoping to see some young people and possibly women who would have questions. So can the mic go to the back? Let's start with the gentleman right there.
There's a woman up, please. There's a woman.
Just a bit. You're next. Yes. So, yes, please stand up and pose your question.
Thank you. Collins Mawa is my name, and I'm a public relations officer, and I come from Uganda. My question is, how can the gains of the African free trade be realized and consolidated in countries where economic institutions are inefficient, corrupt, and sometimes actually non-functional?
Thank you for your question, and then I'll take a last question from the lady who already has
Thank you very much. I'm called Helen Tonifo. I'm from Cameroon. I'm very much impressed with Madam, excuse me, I didn't get her name, the former minister from Nigeria. Yes, Madam Obi, thank you very much. I'm very much impressed with her, you know, her involvement with the girls who were adopted, because, you know, it was like the society was not looking at them, the government was not looking at them, and somebody had to shout. I think in each country, if somebody can stand up for those who are excluded, because those are actually, this is called exclusive policies, whereas we are talking about inclusive policies. But I have a question for her, and that question is, at a time when, you know, we are preaching integration, we are preaching inclusiveness and mobility in the African continent, how do we reconcile that idea with the former idea that those mobile, I don't want to call them migrants, but people who are mobile come with insecurity? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So I'm going to quickly, repeat them. We had the question around competitiveness that Dr. Obi responded to briefly. But if anyone else on the panel wants to address how African innovators can become more competitive and what policies can be put in place to increase that competitiveness, please do. The next comment was perhaps related to whether the African Union has the political power to drive Africa's integration, or what it will take for the African Union to do that. The role of education in higher education, in being able to deliver innovation, building resilient and competitive economies. I'll take the question of the concern raised on social integration as a comment that was enriching, not as a question. But then we move on to what will be the economic benefits of the CFTA in countries where the system is corrupt. And then the final question, how do we reconcile the concern around migrants being a threat to security and the need to be more inclusive? So with that, given in the interest of time, because we have a few other sessions that are about to start in a few minutes, I'm going to ask I'm going to ask our panelists to all make comments. Try to be specific in terms of answering the question, but also give us your takeaways or what you want the people who are in this room today to take away. I hope the audience will have opportunities to speak to you in person or have opportunities to address some of these concerns over social media, where we're continuing the conversation. So, Professor Carlos, if we may start with you.
Well, if you want to see poor in Africa, you are going to see them. If you want to see corrupt people, you are going to see them. If you want to see bad leaders, it's easy. If you want to say that everything is inefficient, certainly you are going to find a lot of inefficiency. If you want to say that you know, we are not capable of industrializing. You are going to see a lot of countries that are not industrializing enough. So we can go on with the list. And so what? What do we do? We just complain? We are happy that it is like that we shout and we say the same thing over and over again? Or we do something about it?
We do something about it.
We have to do something about it. So let's stop this easy way out. You know, the politicians used to say when they can't do something that there is a need for political will. It's a cop-out, political will. What does that mean? It has to be arrested, it has to be promoted, it has to be congenial, it has to be created. That's political will. But you have on the other end of the spectrum, people that are happy all the time just saying negative things. You know, since 2000, our GDP has doubled. You know how many regions in the world had their GDP doubled in history? Not many. One of them was China. Okay, everybody says India is a star performer of the world economy. India has a GDP per capita lower than Africa. India has the same size of trade as Africa in the world, and yet they have 300 million people more than Africa. They are one country, which makes it easier from a political point of view to manage than 55 entities. Yet we have more investment, we have more computers, we have more internet penetration. I can go on with the list. Why is it that the Indians are so self-proud of what is going on there, and we keep just saying bad things about ourselves? It is really a disease that we have to struggle against. It is possible to transform this continent. And it is possible to transform it when each one of us believe, I wouldn't say on everything, but in one transformative bit that we are going to invest on. And it is possible. And we are seeing it happening. I can give you examples that make Africans proud every day in every front. What we need is scale. We need to spread the experiments. But we are not going to be able to reach that spread. We are not going to be able to scale up if we continue with this negativity. I rest my case.
And perhaps on the front of scale, technology and our innovators can play a role in ensuring that we are able to achieve that. Dr. Ibrahim.
Yes, to get into the same vein, which is about Africans always going through auto-flagellation, which is not a source of inspiration. I invite you to read the reports of the high-level panel on emerging technologies, and you will learn how African scientists have already shaped what can be done with drones, with gene drives, with microgrids, and so on. So this is real leapfrogging. Point number 2, youth is not a sociological category. We cannot talk about youth as one category. That doesn't exist. I mean, the nomadic 18-year-old who is in the Sahel is not like the 18-year-old who is in Soweto or the 18-year-old who is in Cairo. We have different types of youth, but all these categories of youth have different needs, different expectations, are in different social contexts. So each government and each region needs to focus on these needs, these expectations, and not get into generalities. What is somehow killing our innovative spirit is that kind of generalization without taking into account the specificities of a local context. Point number 3, I have hardly seen a country which starts to build a good education policy and has a bad health policy. Generally, when a country starts building and implementing a good health policy, it starts to implement also a good education policy. So what does that mean? It means that the role of the state is absolutely crucial. But the way we used to think about the state as the monopolistic power of policy design, that era is finished. Now, we can no longer think in terms of top-down. We have to think in terms of combination of top-down and bottom-up. What does it mean? It means that the different actors organized, and this is where I want to make a point. The revolution of the state will come through the pressure of organized group in the civil society, in the private sector, in organized youth. Don't think that the state has the capability to auto-reform itself. The state needs these actors in order to proceed into an adapted reform. And this is what I call that combination of top-down and bottom-up. Lastly, the African Union is moving steadily in the right direction. We are the only region in the world which has this institutional architecture. We are the only region of the world who has it, with an early warning system regarding political conflicts, with a Peace and Security Council, with strategic frameworks in agriculture, science and technology, environment, in which we try to drive all the national plans. So we have what it takes to make Africa change. The question is, we need to change altogether. There is a Spanish philosopher, Ortega y Gasset, who was saying that all the types of changes can be classified in two categories. The first category is when something changes within the world, and the second category is when the world is changing. The role of the African Union is to make sure that Africa changes, and the instruments are set in order to move into that direction.
Thank you very much, sir. David, you're next.
Yeah, so basically what I can say is like we need to support our young innovators, because the reason why they're doing this is probably to tackle the issues that we're facing as a continent. And most importantly, I think it's also important that we also look and heal the disconnect that exists between the issues on policies and the implementation, especially when it comes to aspects of regional integration. For example, on many occasions, you might find that maybe a trade bloc at the highest level is talking about a policy, but then on the ground, that is not happening. I think that's really a big challenge. But I think as a continent, we're really making some good progress, and governments and the people, we also need to think of ways in which we can think of our own solutions to the problems that we have. I mean, we can only solve our own problems. We cannot expect someone else from somewhere to come and solve our problems. So if we can't do it ourselves, I think we'll really make some good strides as far as our development is concerned.
Thank you, David.
So I believe that Africa will claim the 21st century. And it is not a Pollyannish kind of belief. I believe that the young ones on the continent are the brightest, greatest hope we can have. Because despite all of the hindrances to their greatness, they continue to trudge on. And when you see the vast array of them that came with innovative ideas to this event, it already tells you that across the continent, people are finding solutions to their immediate problems. And that what we need in order to complement this great avidity to find new ways of doing things, find new ideas, find new solutions, is really to reform our governance systems. And to reform our governance systems, we now know, is going to be tough without disrupting our political context. Our political context for a very long time was taken over by those who found nothing else to do than politics. It is now time for the new generation that have real things to do, but would love to have good governments that can support the real things that they have to do to begin to find their way into politics. No longer should your generation be like mine and say, leave those people to be doing their politics. And then you go with your technical solutions and it means nothing to them because there's no incentive to take your technical solutions. Many more of you have to go into politics. Not all of you. The ones amongst you that will go into politics must be the ones who qualify on 3 metrics that I am now using to say we need the right leadership on the continent. You must have character, the values that the professor was talking about. Values must anchor what we do in the public space and the private space of Africa. Character. You must have competence. Knowledge must mean something to you. Knowledge solves problems of the world. So competence in all kinds of fields. Then you must have capacity. Capacity because the problems are daunting, but the problems can be solved. They are real opportunities. I agree with Carlos on the need for us to not beat ourselves up. However, I believe that we need both ends of it. I must beat myself up because I am saying I should be better than this. That's what the continent needs to be saying to itself. Otherwise, we might just enter into a state of complacency. We can't afford it. There are still more than 40% of the people of the continent that are poor. We can't afford that amount of poverty amongst us. So it is in a hurry that we must support the innovators. The innovators are the ones telling us the solutions to multidimensional problems that we have. And let me put a pitch for the women who are innovating. We must not make innovation appear to be masculine. There are many young women across the continent who are finding new ways to solve different problems. They must be right at the table where policy meets practice.
Thank you very
On
much.
higher education, by the way, on higher education, overturn the education system. I was Minister of Education. You've just got to just overhaul the entire thing. I said in the time that I was Minister of Education, we had a dysfunctionality. If you funded the dysfunctionality well, you would just have a well-funded dysfunctionality. You wouldn't have an effective education system. So completely overhaul it. And, you know, my sense is that some presidents who are bold can actually do some strange things, like take a 23-year-old crazy young person and say you're Minister of Education. You'll be shocked the things that will begin to happen in education. All these bureaucratic bottlenecks that stand in the way of new knowledge, new ways of solving society's problems. People, old people who have no interest in market as a mechanism. You know, you talk to them, they tell you, when I was in Paris in 1942, who cares about Paris in 1942? You know, just let it be that we can overhaul these very anachronistic systems that are standing in the way of new ideas. I think I am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obi. And now, Mrs. Oli.
I think
closing remarks.
Dr. Obi's passion is contagious. Huh? I can do that. Sorry. But mine is just simple. Whether we like it or not, the youth are going to take the present and the future into their hands. I am very receptive. I am very, actually, I am relieved and reassured that what we have and the caliber of youth and human capital that we are building or that we have in this continent is going to make that change happen. Whether we like it or not, it's inevitable. happens. It's going to happen. So for me, change will come. And life is an evolution, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. This has been a very interesting, thought-provoking conversation. I'm sure many of you feel like we shouldn't end it here. We need to keep going. But I think we will all have opportunities to connect and keep the conversation going in the following sessions. So with that, I would like to close this panel. Before I let you all move on, I would like to announce that the government of Rwanda has invited all delegates to a cultural night at the Kigali Cultural Village tonight. Buses will be available to take all delegates to the Kigali Cultural Village from 6:15 p.m. The following sessions are being held in the breakout rooms downstairs. Please join promptly as the speakers are waiting for you. Thank you.